welcome to China's Living Legends.
欢迎来到我的频道。
So, I want you to picture a blank piece of paper.
Okay.
Like, it is the year 1376, deep in the Ming Dynasty of China. And the paper itself is probably made of mulberry bark, sturdy, thick, completely empty.
Right.
But at the very bottom of this seemingly innocent page, there's a single square red stamp. A wax seal of official approval.
Just sitting there on a blank page.
Exactly. And on the surface, this looks like a minor administrative shortcut, like maybe a lazy clerk trying to save some time on their daily paperwork. But this single piece of paper is about to trigger a literal bloodbath.
Oh, yeah. A massive one.
We're talking about a cascade of paranoia and state-sponsored terror that will drag clerks out of their homes in chains and result in the executions of tens of thousands of people.
It's honestly hard to wrap your head around the scale of it.
It really is. And I want to welcome you to this deep dive, because today we're looking at something that feels like distant ancient history, but is actually a window into this universal human struggle that still completely shapes our modern world today.
Yeah, the eternal brutal war between centralized absolute control or the messy practical reality of actually getting things done.
Right.
Because it's worse than a paradox, actually. Yeah. It's an unavoidable trap. If you're running a massive, unimaginably complex organization, whether that's a 14th century agrarian empire or, a modern multinational corporation, you face this fundamental dilemma.
How do you maintain absolute integrity and total control over your domains without, completely paralyzing your own operations in the process?
Exactly, because if you clamp down too hard, the machine breaks down, nothing moves.
Yeah.
But if you loosen the grip to let people do their jobs,
you risk losing your absolute power.
Precisely.
So our mission today is to unpack this specific historical crisis. It's known as the blank seal case, or Kongyinan. And we really need to figure out how a simple bureaucratic workaround became an existential threat to the state, and what this terrifying purge reveals about the architecture of power itself.
Well, to really grasp the sheer madness of the blank seal case, we first have to understand the architect of this era. This is Zhu Yuanzhang, better known as the Hongwu Emperor.
Okay.
He reigned from 1368 to 1398. And his origin story, it defies belief. He was born a destitute peasant.
Like absolute bottom of the social hierarchy.
The very bottom. He survived plagues. He was an orphan. He literally begged for food, lived as a wandering Buddhist monk, and eventually, somehow, he becomes a rebel military leader.
Wow.
And against all odds, he miraculously drives out the Mongol-led Yuan Dynasty and founds the Ming Dynasty.
Which, that sounds like a triumphant underdog story.
It does.
But his defining trait, the thing that colored his entire reign, was this ruthless, systematized paranoia. Like, he orchestrated these massive, horrific purges known as the Four Great Hongwu Cases.
Yeah, they were brutal.
Let me give you just one example. In the Lan Yu case, he accused an esteemed loyal general of treason. But he didn't just execute the general. He had the man flayed, stuffed his skin, and then proceeded to round up and execute 15,000 people connected to him.
Just unimaginable violence.
Teachers, distant relatives, casual acquaintances, all wiped out.
It was the eradication of an entire social network over a mere suspicion.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I struggle to understand this. If you literally starved as a peasant, if you rose from the dirt to the top of the world, shouldn't you have empathy for your people and your government? Like, he knows how hard life is. Why default straight to mass murder? That feels completely counterintuitive.
I know, it seems contradictory, but his background is actually the exact driver of that violence.
Really?
Yeah. The Hongwu Emperor had this fierce, visceral aversion to elite corruption. When he was starving as a young man, he watched corrupt local magistrates hoard grain while the peasantry just, died in the streets.
Oh, wow. So it's deeply personal.
Extremely personal. Because of that trauma, he trusted no one with an education, a pedigree, or a title. He understood that to consolidate a fractured post-war China, he had to completely dismantle any independent power bases. So his paranoia wasn't just a psychological character flaw.
It was a strategy.
Yes. It was orchestrated terror utilized as statecraft. He weaponized extreme violence to enforce absolute, unquestioning obedience from his own bureaucracy. This actually mirrors the High Middle Ages in Europe,
Oh, how so?
You look at monarchs like Henry II of England or Philip IV of France, and they sought to brutally curb the power of entrenched feudal lords. It's the universal autocratic playbook. break the independent centers of power so that nobody beneath you is even capable of challenging your sovereign supremacy.
Right, but think about what happens to an organization when institutionalized fear is the only glue holding it together.
Right. It severely erodes meritocracy.
Exactly. Survival in the Ming court didn't mean being innovative or being the best at your job. Survival meant sycophancy. It meant aggressive agreement with the emperor and just keeping your head down.
Just nodding along.
Imagine working in an office where the only thing that keeps you from facing the executioner is total unblinking compliance.
A nightmare. But so, if you can't trust the elites and you can't trust your own staff, how do you actually govern? Because you can't just wave a sword around to collect taxes across an empire.
You're right, you have to build a system.
A system so airtight it doesn't require trust at all. And that meant creating the most obsessive paperwork the world had ever seen up to that point. Welcome to the Hubu, the Ministry of Revenue.
The Hubu. And the scale of what they attempted to do is staggering.
Oh, completely.
They had to account for every single ounce of wealth in a pre-digital agrarian empire that spanned millions of square miles. They tracked millions of households, specifically logging the able-bodied males, which were called the Ding for labor and military conscription.
But their absolute masterpiece was the Yulin Tuse,
The fish scale registers.
which is an incredible name, by the way.
First of all, incredible name. And they were called that because they were these breathtakingly meticulous cadastral maps.
And let's define cadastral here, because it is crucial. This isn't just a map showing where the rivers and mountains are.
Right, it's not a geographical map.
Exactly. A cadastral map shows the exact legal boundaries of every single farm. It shows who owns what specific patch of dirt, the fertility grade of that soil, and every single time that land changes hands. The overlapping property lines drawn on the paper literally looked like the scales of a fish.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. They are essentially building the ultimate analog spreadsheet in the 14th century.
Yeah, tens of thousands of clerks literally walking the fields with measuring sticks.
But why? Why dedicate so much state capacity to dirt and property lines? Why the obsessive overlapping detail on this?
Because in a pre-modern state, land is the sole bedrock of survival and taxation. There is no stock market. There is no, tech sector. Wealth is grain, and wealth is the land that grows it. The Yulin Tuse allowed the central government to extract the agricultural surplus with terrifying efficiency.
So they needed to know everything.
Everything. If you want to control the empire, you must control the ledger. You have to know exactly what you have so that no local official in a distant province can hide a fertile valley from you and keep the taxes for themselves. Think of it as the 11th century version of William the Conqueror's Doomsday Book in England.
Oh, right, the Doomsday Book.
Yeah, a monumental effort to quantify the realm's wealth right down to the last pig and cow. Or conceptually, it's exactly what the 18th century French physiocrats argued centuries later.
Wait, what did they argue?
They believed that all true national wealth originates solely from agricultural productivity, making the land the ultimate engine of state power. The Ming Dynasty just put that theory into practice with unprecedented rigor. It just proves that data collection has always been the ultimate weapon of statecraft.
Okay, but data on a beautiful, pristine spreadsheet in the capital is very different from the muddy physical reality on the ground.
Absolutely.
And this is where the strict rules crash headfirst into the brutal physical realities of the 1300s. Let's talk about the logistical nightmare of actually moving this wealth.
Right. Put yourself in the shoes of a provincial official. Your district has collected its taxes in the form of raw grain and silver ingots.
Okay.
Now you have to physically transport those assets across thousands of miles of rough terrain, rivers, and mountains to get it to the capital in Nanjing.
And things go wrong. It rains for 3 weeks straight, the wooden carts sink into the mud, and the grain rots in the back.
Yep.
Or you experience something called ho-hao, which translates to fire loss.
Ugh. Fire loss.
Yeah.
Such a fascinating mechanism. So when local officials collected silver, it came in all shapes and purities. To standardize it for the imperial treasury, they had to melt the silver down in crucibles and recast it into official ingots.
Right.
But every time you melt silver, impurities burn off, or tiny amounts of the precious metal literally stick to the sides of the crucible. You physically lose mass.
Think of it like currency exchange fees at an airport. Every time you move your money from one currency to another, the kiosk takes a little bite out of it. You physically lose money just by moving it through the system.
That's a great analogy.
That was the fire loss the bureaucrats couldn't avoid. And here's the trick. The emperor's ledgers in the capital are perfect.
Flawless.
If you finally arrive at the Ministry of Revenue after a 2-month journey and your massive, meticulously stamped ledger says you are delivering 10,000 ounces of silver, but your carts only hold 9,800 because of fire loss?
You are in serious trouble. The Ministry of Revenue will reject the entire delivery because your documents do not perfectly match your cargo.
And the punishment for that discrepancy is severe, like beatings, imprisonment, exile.
And to fix it, you couldn't just, take a brush and cross out the number.
Right, no whiteout.
The rules demanded that you travel 2 months back to your home province, get a brand new document drawn up, have it stamped with the official provincial seal by your superiors, and then travel 2 months back to the capital.
Which would bankrupt the entire local government just in travel expenses. It was a recipe for total administrative paralysis.
Completely.
So what does this all mean for the officials? Because to me, it sounds less like a sinister conspiracy against the throne and more like desperate bureaucrats just trying to survive an impossible commute without losing their heads.
Well, exactly. The economic rationale is completely undeniable. The transaction costs of those round trips were prohibitive. So they created that clever, illicit fix.
The blank forms?
Right. Carrying pre-sealed blank forms to fill in the actual numbers upon arrival. This workaround gave local officials what economists call operational flexibility. Now, to be fair, they also used this flexibility to levy informal surcharges on the peasantry things called zhuangxian, or contributions.
Ah, okay.
They used these extra off-the-books funds to pay for the melted silver, fix local bridges, or, frankly, line their own pockets. It created a shadow budget.
But that shadow budget was born of survival and efficiency.
Yes, it filled the massive gaps left by the emperor's rigid formal rules. It's a perfect parallel to medieval England's exchequer struggling with tally sticks to reconcile distant, delayed tax accounts. Or, on a modern level, it mirrors the timeless bureaucratic practice of padding expense reports.
Oh, for sure. If corporate mandates a travel budget that doesn't actually cover the cost of a hotel, employees will inevitably find a creative way to expense their meals to create a buffer.
Exactly. Give people impossible rules, and they will invent a workaround just to do their jobs.
It is the very definition of good enough governance. The system adapted to survive its own impossible demands. And for a while, it worked. The taxes flowed. The capital was fed.
But the Hongwu Emperor didn't care about good enough governance.
He absolutely did not. The year is 1376. Emperor Hongwu discovers this practice. He finds out that all across his empire, for years, officials have been carrying around blank pieces of paper with his official seals on them.
Oh, right.
And we don't just see anger here. We see a catastrophic, system-wide purge.
Because he doesn't see a logistical shortcut. He sees a catastrophic breach of control.
Right. So he unleashes the secret police. He orders mass arrests. Hundreds of high-ranking officials are hauled out into the courtyards and executed. But it doesn't stop there because of a terrifying legal mechanism called lianzuo, the system of collective punishment.
The ripple effect of that is just horrifying.
If you are a clerk who carried a blank form, the state didn't just kill you. They killed or exiled your parents, your siblings, your cousins, and sometimes your neighbors. Tens of thousands of people were swept up in this slaughter.
Just unimaginable terror over paperwork.
Right. And amidst all this bloodshed, there is one guy, a lone censor named Zheng Xiwan, who bravely steps forward. He formally protests to the emperor.
Brave man.
He argues that these blank forms lacked independent legal force, like they were just paper until the grain was weighed. He points out they violated no explicit written law.
And what happens to him?
For his brilliant, totally rational legal defense, Zheng Xiwan was immediately thrown into a dungeon.
Of course he was.
But wait, so why does that matter? Why execute tens of thousands of people over a procedural shortcut that was actually saving the empire time and money? Like, rationally, it makes no sense.
To understand the emperor's wrath, we have to unpack the psychological concept of qijon, which translates to deceiving the sovereign. You have to remember, for an autocrat, the physical seal, that red square of wax or ink, is not just a stamp.
What is it then?
It is the physical manifestation of his divine mandate to rule. So pre-sealing a blank document effectively transfers the emperor's absolute divine authority into the hands of a low-level clerk.
Oh my.
It is an existential threat to centralized control and an absolute gateway to corruption.
It's quite literally like handing a blank check signed by God to a middle manager.
That is the perfect way to put it. This actually mirrors the ideological battles over the divine right of kings in 17th century England, but applied to paperwork. Alternatively, look at the Magna Carta in 1215.
Right. The barons and King John.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The English barons wanted to bind the king to established written rules. Hongwu's Purge is the exact opposite of that. The emperor is asserting his absolute power to unbind himself from any administrative flexibility that didn't come directly from his mouth.
So he establishes this terrifying precedent. He is broadcasting that absolute centralized control and sovereign integrity are far more important than practical day-to-day governance.
Yeah.
He embeds a deep trauma into the political culture, which brings us to the massive structural flaw this entire bloody case exposes.
The imperial paradox.
Exactly. The emperor built this highly disciplined, terrifyingly precise system to constrain his bureaucracy. He wanted the machine to run perfectly.
With his fish scale registers and impossible ledgers.
Right. But then he realizes the trap. If he relies entirely on those formal institutions, if he plays by his own ledgers, he becomes just a cog in his own machine. So to prove he is still the undisputed master, he disregards his own institutions to create exceptions through violence.
He breaks the machine to prove he owns it.
If you build an airtight system, but then you have to constantly break your own rules with mass executions to maintain your power over it, doesn't that inherently destroy the public's trust in the entire system? Why would anyone follow the rules?
Well, they wouldn't. And that is the imperial paradox. To govern effectively, an empire needs institutional principle standardized rules, but also operational flexibility, local adaptation. The monarch uses exception making, like sudden treason charges, to stay agile and maintain leverage.
But that backfires, doesn't it?
Completely. It creates pervasive uncertainty. When the rule of law becomes capricious, institutional permeability rots the state from the inside out.
Because everyone just focuses on covering their own tracks.
Exactly. It's a perfect parallel to the ongoing debates in the United States over federalism, the constant tug-of-war between strong central mandates and states' rights.
Oh, that's a really good point.
Or look at the modern presidency's use of executive orders to bypass legislative gridlock. It grants agility in the short term, but it risks undermining the institutional framework in the long run.
The machine becomes brittle. The blank seal case perfectly encapsulates the fragility of autocratic power. The very tools used to project absolute control are the same tools that erode the foundation of long-term stability.
They absolutely are. And this leads us to the masker lesson of this whole thing. The blank seal case is not just a gruesome story of a tyrannical emperor and a few unlucky accountants. It is the ultimate masterclass in the limits of institutional design.
Yeah.
The true lesson is that any system of governance that relies on fear and arbitrary exceptions to function will eventually consume itself. True power isn't about rigid, absolute control. It's about building systems resilient enough to trust local realities.
That is such a profound takeaway. So think about the organizations, the companies, or the systems you navigate every day. If you were the architect of a vast system, which risk would you choose to tolerate? The somewhat chaotic, shadow budget corruption of giving your people total flexibility to bend the rules, or the paralyzing, tyrannical inefficiency of demanding absolute, airtight control? Let us know what you think. Imagine you are tasked with running the largest, most complex organization on the planet. I mean, we are talking millions of people, vast territories, and, critical infrastructure that needs constant maintenance. And your bosses sit you down and say, we expect you to be a saint.
Right. Utterly incorruptible. Which, sounds like a pretty noble mission at first glance.
It does, yeah. But then they hand you your paycheck, and it is barely enough to afford a single decent meal a week, let alone pay for the massive staff you need to actually do your job.
Yeah. And that is where soaring moral ideology violently crashes into economic reality.
Yeah.
You just cannot engineer moral perfection in a system that openly defies the basic laws of human sustenance.
Exactly. So today we are taking a deep dive into a really fascinating stack of historical analyses and economic dossiers we've compiled on the Ming and Qing dynasties. Our mission today is to unpack this epic struggle to pay a massive bureaucracy and how an attempt to force ethical behavior through mandated poverty completely, spectacularly backfired.
It's basically a recipe for systemic collapse, just wrapped in the guise of ideological purity. When a state demands everything but funds nothing, it forces its own agents to become predators just to survive.
To really understand how wild this gets on the ground, we have to look at a man named Hai Rui. He was a legendary mid-Ming Dynasty official living in the 1500s.
A really fascinating historical figure.
Right. The sources highlight his status as a Zheng Sampan. That translates to a powerful third-rank civil official, which is essentially a provincial governor overseeing millions of people. By all accounts, he was the absolute archetype of the incorruptible scholar official.
The literal gold standard of virtue.
Yes, but he was so famously uncorrupted and therefore so completely impoverished that when he bought a mere 1.2 kilograms of meat for his mother's birthday, it was the talk of the entire imperial capital. People were literally whispering about it in the streets.
Just for buying a tiny bit of pork? It's crazy.
It really is. And when he eventually died, his personal assets were so non-existent that he couldn't even afford his own funeral. His colleagues literally had to pool their spare change just to bury him.
Okay, let's unpack this. Wait, so why does that matter? Like, if he was a high-ranking governor controlling vast resources, shouldn't he inherently be at least comfortable? Why was buying a tiny bit of meat an absolute scandal? Because Hai Rui's legendary poverty exposes the hidden, almost toxic logic of the Ming state. You see, Ming salaries were chronically, deliberately depressed by design. The state intentionally externalized the cost of governance.
Externalized it how? Like making the officials pay for the state themselves.
Exactly. If you were a third-rank official like Hai Rui, society expected you to maintain a grand household. You had to entertain visiting dignitaries, support a vast retinue of staff to run your administration, and, engage in complex networks of patronage.
Right. You are basically running a small country.
Yeah, but your formal pay from the imperial treasury couldn't even cover the basics of your own physical survival, let alone those massive professional expectations. So Hai Rui's poverty wasn't just him being a virtuous, frugal guy.
It was a statement.
It was a performative critique of a fundamentally broken system. He was showing the emperor, look, this is what happens when you actually follow your laws to the letter. I am starving. What's fascinating here is this actually mirrors the English concept of the unpaid public servant.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, if we look at the medieval period well into the 19th century, English justices of the peace and even members of parliament were completely unpaid. The expectation in England was that these roles would be filled exclusively by gentlemen of independent means.
So wealthy aristocrats who didn't even need a salary because they had vast estates generating revenue.
Precisely. In both the English and the Ming systems, a severe lack of official salary restricted power. In England, it restricted power to the already wealthy. But in China, where positions were earned through grueling meritocratic civil service exams, it forced incredibly smart, capable men from modest backgrounds into implicit corruption just to survive.
Wow, because they didn't have family estates to fall back on? It's like winning the ultimate academic lottery, but the prize is a massive debt you can't pay off without breaking the law.
Yeah, and Hai Rui essentially became an impossible benchmark. His legacy proves that true rectitude in an underfunded system requires a radical, almost impossible detachment from material reality. You basically have to be willing to starve, to be honest.
And very few people are willing to starve, especially when they hold the levers of power. Which brings us to a massive question of cause and effect. Like, how did this trap get built in the first place?
Yeah, you really have to look at the founder of the dynasty for that.
Right. The historical dossier point to the founder of the Ming Dynasty in the 14th century, Emperor Hongwu. His backstory is like something out of a cinematic epic. He was a destitute peasant, an orphan whose family died of starvation, a beggar, a monk, and eventually a rebel leader.
He was a man forged in absolute trauma. He experienced the sharpest edges of poverty and witnessed the devastating effects of local corruption firsthand.
And it absolutely dominated his policymaking. Here's where it gets really interesting. Hongwu decreed that her first-rank official salary, the absolute highest civilian rank in the empire, would be 1,044 shit of unmilled rice.
Which is a very specific, weirdly calculated number.
Yeah, and it translates to about 62.6 metric tons of grain a year. Now, 62 tons sounds like a mountain of rice, but let's look at the historical precedent our sources provide. If you go back 1,500 years prior to the Han Dynasty, a roughly equivalent top-tier role received 10,000 shit.
Wow, so Hongwu instituted a staggering 90% pay cut for the highest offices in the land, at least compared to historical norms.
A 90% drop in real income. And think about the sheer logistics of being paid in raw, unmilled grain. How do you pay your clerks with a sack of rice? How do you transport 62 tons of grain across a continent without half of it rotting or being eaten by rats?
It's practically useless as a liquid administrative budget.
Exactly. Yet even wilder, Hongwu enshrined this austerity as zuoji, That means immutable ancestral precedent. He basically locked this rice-based pay scale in stone, making it practically a religious and legal violation for any future emperor to ever change it.
The ultimate administrative straitjacket right there.
But wait, I have to ask, why would an emperor deliberately impoverish the very people running his empire? He has to know they need resources to manage infrastructure.
Well, you have to look at Hongwu's psychology and his ruthless political strategy. Because of his peasant background, he had a visceral hatred for the wealthy elite. He genuinely believed that low pay would enforce frugality.
Like, if you don't give them money, they can't afford to be corrupt.
Exactly. He thought they couldn't become corrupt luxury seekers. But politically, it was a masterclass in absolute centralization. By stripping officials of substantial liquid income, he prevented them from amassing enough independent wealth to challenge the throne. He wanted a bureaucracy that was permanently precarious. It's a perfect parallel to King Louis XIV of France.
Oh, the Sun King. Because of Versailles, right?
You got it. He also sought to strip potential rivals of independent power bases. But instead of starving them of rice, he used a different economic lever, Versailles. Louis XIV drew the high nobility to his massive palace and forced them to spend astronomical sums on fashion, gambling, and court rituals.
So they were basically too broke to start a rebellion.
Exactly. He transformed independent feudal lords into bankrupt courtiers who were entirely dependent on royal patronage just to maintain their status. Both Hongwu and Louis XIV used economic engineered precarity to neutralize potential threats, ensuring all power flowed directly from the monarch.
Wow, it's control through financial strangulation. But the legacy of Hongwu's Zuzi, this immutable ancestral precedent, it really shows the danger of elevating a founder's personal trauma and austerity into permanent policy. Attempting to enforce a moral economy through rigid decrees completely ignores economic reality.
It just doesn't work long term.
No, it's like a modern corporation locking in 1990 salaries forever while inflation skyrockets and just expecting everyone to work out of loyalty. It ultimately ossifies policy and perpetuates dysfunction for generations.
And, nature abhors a vacuum. When the formal system is paralyzed by dysfunction, an informal system will always rise to replace it.
Which brings us to the devastating realities on the ground. Because that immutable salary of rice was practically unlivable and logistically absurd to transport, we have to look at how these officials actually survived.
Right, because the government still had to function somehow.
Exactly. If the state isn't paying for the government, who is? Welcome to the shadow bureaucracy. The sources detail how local magistrates were sent to provinces where they didn't even speak the local dialect.
Which is a whole other level of difficulty.
Yeah. They were expected to handle murder trials, tax collection, and river management, but they were forced to pay their own administrative costs out of pocket. To handle this impossible workload, they had to hire Shai. These were highly skilled private secretaries.
Right, they were the actual gears turning the local government machinery.
But ironically, because these Shia operated outside the official state payroll in a free market for talent, these private secretaries routinely demanded and earned far more money than the magistrates who hired them. It's a complete inversion of the hierarchy.
It really is.
To fund all of this, plus the local police and couriers, officials had to invent a whole dictionary of euphemisms for extortion. First, there was shengli, which translates to customary fees. This was basically a mandatory tip you had to pay just to get a clerk to look at your paperwork.
Just to get in the door, basically.
Yeah.
Necessity breeds a very dark kind of innovation.
It really does. But the true heavyweight was called huhao. This was a meltage fee surcharge added to silver tax payments. The official excuse was that when everyday citizens paid taxes, they usually brought in irregular, chopped-up bits of silver.
Like pieces of bracelets or loose coins.
Yeah, so the tax office had to melt all this scrap down into standardized boat-shaped silver ingots called sai to send to the capital.
And naturally, when you melt silver, a tiny fraction of the metal is lost to oxidation or sticks to the crucible. It's a genuine pre-industrial monetary inefficiency.
Right, but the officials weaponized that tiny technicality. Instead of charging the actual 1 or 2% lost in the melt, they would charge a 10%, sometimes 20% surcharge. They claimed it was all for meltage, and they would just pocket the massive difference.
That is just blatant theft disguised as a processing fee.
Imagine a peasant bringing in their meager savings, only to be told their silver is miraculously 20% lighter than it actually is. So what does this all mean for the average citizen? Were they just caught in an endless loop of legalized shakedowns?
They absolutely were. And the macroeconomic driver making this so much worse was severe inflation. The Ming Dynasty saw a massive influx of New World silver flowing in from global trade.
Oh, so the value of silver was dropping while they were paying these fees.
Yeah, and that fixed rice salary established by Hongwu centuries ago, its purchasing power completely plummeted. The imperial center looked the other way regarding the huhao because it knew it couldn't afford to pay its officials a living wage. The state tacitly authorized its own agents to live off the land.
Effectively turning them into an occupying force.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the 18th century equivalent of the Roman Republic's publicani, or the French Ancien Regime's venality of office.
Oh, I've heard of the publicani. Were those the Roman tax farmers?
Yes. The Roman Senate didn't have a massive internal revenue service. Instead, they auctioned off the right to collect taxes in the provinces. Wealthy Romans, the publicani, would pay the state a lump sum up front. Then they would go to a province and squeeze the local populace for double or triple what they paid, keeping the surplus.
Wow, just pure profit off the backs of the citizens.
Right, and French tax farmers operated on a very similar principle. In all these systems, the state externalizes the cost of administration onto the populace by privatizing public service. And it is incredibly toxic to society.
It really is. When a centralized state starves its bureaucracy financially, it forces public service into predatory extraction. It's not the grand, high-level political scandals in the imperial palace that destroy a dynasty.
No, it's the everyday stuff.
It's this granular, everyday corruption. When a farmer has to bribe a clerk just to file a land deed or pay their taxes, that destroys public trust far more effectively than any palace intrigue.
It creates a populace that views the state not as a protector, but as a parasite.
But history occasionally delivers a dramatic, pragmatic plot twist. Centuries after Hongwu set this impossible standard, the empire is buckling under the weight of this shadow economy. We enter the Ming Dynasty, and we meet the Hongwu Emperor in the early 1700s.
This is where things get really fascinating.
Yeah, because instead of just executing corrupt officials or preaching more Confucian morality about frugality, he looks at this massive shadow economy of extortion, and he launches a radical reform called Huohao Gugong. He actually legalizes the illicit meltage fee.
It is a brilliant, entirely unsentimental piece of administrative alchemy.
Right. He basically says, okay, I know everyone is collecting huohao, fine. It is no longer a secret bribe. It is now a legal, regulated tax. He centralizes its collection into the provincial treasuries, so local magistrates can't just pocket it.
He brought it out of the shadows.
Yes, and then he uses that massive new pool of on-the-books revenue to pay his officials a huge, regulated supplemental salary called Yanglian Yin. This translates wonderfully to nourishing integrity silver. We were talking payouts that were sometimes 100 times their base salary.
He finally gave them what the system had denied them for centuries, which was a functional living wage.
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here. Isn't legalizing a bribe just throwing your hands up in defeat? How is formalizing extortion a solution to systemic corruption?
I mean, it sounds completely counterintuitive, but it is the essence of brilliant pragmatism. Yongsheng realized what Hongwu never did, that moral exhortation is completely useless against starvation. By bringing the shadow economy out of the dark and onto the official books, he gave the central state accurate revenue figures for the first time in centuries.
Because it's no longer a secret shakedown in a back room, there is an actual ledger now.
Exactly. He realigned the economic incentives. Once officials had a guaranteed robust income through the Yanglian Yin, they no longer had the excuse of poverty. Yongsheng could finally hold them strictly accountable.
So if you still took bribes, there were severe consequences.
Oh, if you took bribes after receiving your nourishing integrity silver, the punishments were swift and incredibly severe. He didn't legalize corruption. He legalized the funding mechanism necessary to eradicate the need for corruption. This raises an important question about modern institutions, because this perfectly mirrors the 19th century British Northcote Trevelyan civil service reforms.
That rings a bell. Was that when Britain finally modernized its government?
Yes. For a long time, Western nations operated on patronage and fee-based offices. Aristocrats would buy a government post, and the bureaucrats beneath them survived on tips, bribes, and fees extracted from the public. Very much like the Shungli.
Ah, so the public was footing the bill there too.
Right. The Northcote Trevelyan Report in the 1850s sparked the transition to a professional, salaried civil service based on merit exams rather than aristocratic birth. The British realized just as young Zheng did, that you have to sever the link between an official's personal survival and their ability to extract wealth from the public.
You have to pay people properly from the central treasury if you want them to be impartial administrators. It's such a powerful lesson in statecraft. The legacy of Yang Li and Yin proves that true institutional reform requires confronting existing ugly realities.
You really have to look at how people are actually surviving.
Yeah, bring those informal systems under regulatory control and fund them properly. You can't just wish away corruption with moral decrees or lock in ancient precedents that ignore inflation. You cannot simply mandate goodness, you have to fund it.
Which brings us to the master lesson of this entire historical arc. The Ming and Qing dynasties prove, unequivocally, that a state's moral ambitions are entirely constrained by its fiscal architecture. You cannot legislate a flawless, incorruptible government while simultaneously defying the basic economic laws of human sustenance and administrative costs.
Absolutely.
If you design a system where honesty guarantees destitution, you're designing a system that guarantees corruption.
It is the ultimate reality check for any organization, ancient or modern. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the source material, I want to turn this back to you, the listener. We've spent our time today talking about emperors, massive rice salaries, and ancient silver taxes, but look at the modern world around us.
Yeah, the parallels are definitely there.
We are living in an era where gig work, side hustles, and contract labor are increasingly replacing stable, salaried careers with benefits. By stripping away guaranteed living wages and forcing people to piece together their survival through multiple unbenefited gigs, are we inadvertently rebuilding the exact same economic precarity that forced ancient imperial officials to compromise their integrity? When the system demands professional perfection but pays in pennies, who really pays the ultimate price? Something to mull over.
If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.